Okay, let's start. For next Thursday, I'm looking for someone to present a paper on Stuxnet, the worm which has attacked the Iranian centrifuge. So I would give a shot if anyone wants to volunteer. I still have to pick a good paper, but if not, then I'll. Can I do that one instead? Nope. You can do two. uh, okay, no one volunteers. Then let's see. I'll, I'll send an email out after the class with the paper and the name. Okay, so last time around, towards the end, I was talking about some of the design mechanisms that um, one should adopt when it comes to maintaining privacy. And I guess there were some general principles I had brought out: compute share the answer, not kind of the raw sensor data because it's very leaky, and also try to um, obfuscate or sanitize the data in manners, and I kind of talked about that. One thing that I pointed out was that encryption technology is pretty good and readily available. There are good software packages and stuff like that. But there are a few issues which sort of come up with it. So one which I hadn't said, but sort of often emerges, and again later today you would see also, which is a lot of time devices are either cost constrained or energy constrained, so they have ended up using weaker crypto, which gets broken easily. But the other issue is that in many settings, you have to you want the recipient to get some sort of a computation over the data. So even though the recipient doesn't need the data per se, the current crypto mechanisms, kind of the combination of that as well as the way large-scale computing gets done, you often end up having to share the raw data. So a very typical scenario is that we want to publish some data to some sort of an aggregator, and then the recipient is interested in some computation over it, like a query or a function or some model learning or some inference making, and there may be many different parties that are all interested in different variants of it. So the solution basically either boils down to you hand over the unencrypted data to this custodian, who you trust, and anytime you have to trust someone, that's a potential vulnerability in the system, or alternatively you have to give the key to the eventual recipient, and both of those things are kind of bad. So what has emerged in recent times is this notion that can we do computation over encrypted data? So I want you to know f of x. Can I take x, can I encrypt it, hand it over to you, and then somehow you can only get f of x? That's one scenario. And the other is, can I send my data to, let's say, Amazon for some computation to be done? I'm paying Amazon on their elastic computing network, but I don't want them to know X. Okay, so can I send encrypted X, have the program run on Amazon servers, and then the answer, and then something comes back to me, and I can know the answer from that, but Amazon never gets to see X, right? So these are the two scenarios. One is I want some computation to be done. Can I do it by sending encrypted data? And the other is I want to share with you a specific function and no more. Okay, so, and there are other kind of other forms of this problem. Another one could be, for example, let's say all of us have some private data and we want to compute some function of it. Let's say, I don't know, average or median or something like that. Could we do it in a manner where I don't learn your values? No one learns anything other than, of course, their own private value and the end result. Okay, and whatever can be inferred from the end result. So obviously, if there are only two of us and we are computing sum, then I know the sum, I know mine, so I can infer yours. Okay, but if on the other hand there are three of us, then knowing sum, all I know is the addition of the other two and no more. So whatever is revealed by the answer, by the function, of course, that in conjunction with my own private value, that is the loss of privacy you are undertaking the moment you are participating in this computation, but no more. So variety of approaches to this thing has emerged, but they all kind of boil down to this notion of so firstly, there's one category where we just trust. Okay, so leave those aside. We trust someone. We trust a central entity, and we say, we are all comfortable with sharing our raw data to that entity, and then that entity computes. A big a holy grail for a long while was, can I do arbitrary computation where if I encrypt X and then we compute some function over that, and then so function over, instead of function of X, function over some encrypted version of X, and then from the resulting answer can I get back f of X, and could we do it for arbitrary functions? And some years ago, some work out of IBM and Stanford kind of resulted in that breakthrough where, at least in principle, it's possible that I can encrypt X in a manner that f of encrypted X is the same as encrypted version of f of X. And there are some subtleties on how, so this thing works great over finite fields, but over real numbers, you run into some issues, but they're addressable. But the bigger issue is that it's computationally very expensive. But at this stage, what we do know is, and this is something I was covering at the very end, that if the computation is partially homomorphic, what that means is that my computation only involves addition and multiplication by constants, but not multiplication of two variables, then we can do this kind of homomorphic encryption quite efficiently. By quite efficiently, we mean that in case of full homomorphic, it's like 6, 7, maybe 10 order of magnitude slower, and with partially homomorphic, maybe couple of order of magnitude slower. So it becomes reasonable for small amounts of computation to be done. Now, luckily, a lot of things are kind of a typical linear type system has this characteristic. Okay, so a lot of machine learning algorithms, signal processing algorithms, image processing stuff, they can all be done in a partially homomorphic manner. So it is kind of if your computation is in the category where some amount of hit is okay, then you can certainly kind of do it. A lot of querying, a lot of stuff can be done. So essentially, you encrypt the data using a key, which only you know. You never share it with anyone. You send the data to the server. The server runs the very same program. It would same function, except it's now doing it over the encrypted data, and the data is encrypted in a particular manner. And then what you are getting back is the function over encrypted X, but it is equivalent to function encryption of function of X. And since you have the key, you can decrypt it. So there are ready-made packages. There's stuff there's a library for this kind of stuff on GitHub. There's a professor, some work out of MIT and Berkeley kind of have released a lot of packages and all. So this is something that you can kind of use. There is so a particular form of computation which gets used is where like I said, addition is kept secret and multiplication by constant can be kept secret. It's called Pallier partial homomorphic crypto systems. So this stuff has been around for a while, but only kind of in recent times now you're seeing kind of packages and all emerge. So this is some work out of MIT where they show that a whole bunch of stuff that we commonly use in data analysis, perceptron, least square optimization, support vector machine, naive Bayes, decision trees, these kind of things, they can all be done in this particular manner. So, and my student he kind of did some work where for image processing, kind of the same idea. So what's the catch? I mean, obviously there is slowdown, but if you're willing to create make use of GPUs or FPGAs or things like that, you can compensate for a lot of it. The bigger issue is that encryption does result in bloating of the data, so you do take a hit on the data size. So that's the approach which is emerged. Fully homomorphic encryption, while there is a library, a few libraries floating around, there's one from IBM which exists on GitHub, so you can write these systems, but they are quite slow. Now, when the reason I'm talking about multiplication and addition and multiplication, because in theoretical terms you can show that computation can be expressed like a circuit, and if the circuit has both multiplication and addition, then you can do arbitrary computation. Okay, so that's kind of hand wavy proof that anything you wish to compute can be done if you're allowed to have a circuit which have both multiply and add. The other approach which has emerged as a practical solution there, and I guess it's not, I guess at a theoretical level, not as exciting as, let's say, fully homomorphic encryption is, but in a practical term it is. It's basically saying that, look, could I reduce the could I be comfortable with who I need to trust? And this notion of secure hardware enclave basically says that, okay, you know, when I run something on Amazon, maybe I don't trust Amazon, maybe I don't trust the Linux distribution, the operating system provider. Who am I willing to trust? What about Intel? Okay, so the processor maker. So remember, in theory, you could imagine sort of pretty sophisticated attacks where Amazon, if they are really after stealing your data, they can implement their own processor, sort of say, where they can snag data at the register level and stuff like that, right? I mean, they could conceivably run your program on a virtual machine which is running at the instruction emulation level, and they have access to every bit level state of a processor, and whatever they can steal from it, they can. So the idea out here is that we actually go deep down to the silicon level. In the processor, at the silicon level, there is some secret embedded which results in your application being able to figure out that is it running on a does it have a shared secret with Intel or the processor manufacturer, and then the processor is designed in a manner, barring bugs, in a manner where even the operating system does not have visibility into certain operations and certain memory. So I could send an application to a remote server, and that application can now enter an enclave, do it in a manner only if it is convinced that it passes that we can validate it with respect to a key which is shared with Intel in some manner, and then it can run inside the enclave, and you have the assurance that the operating system cannot look into that memory, operating system cannot know what instruction you were running, and things like that. There are a lot of gotchas, and over the past year or so, attacks have emerged. One theme, and which we'll hopefully see in more depth in one of the lectures, is that there are always side channel attacks. So much like the recent attacks on the processors which made use of the timing channel, it turns out that some of these secure enclaves can be broken into by exploiting the fact that computation running inside the enclave still leaves some footprint in the in other manners, like something in the cache, for example. So and there is also still some dependency on the operating system, like the operating system can still stop the processor or change the frequency of the processor. It can still play certain kind of games, but nevertheless, fair advance, and I think as processor vendors are learning about these side channels, they are being kind of stamped down also. So this whole secure hardware enclave plus kind of more like this trusted computing base has emerged as another another possibility. And again, in a later lecture, we'll dive more into detail. So stepping back then, I mean, we saw the security and privacy kind of thing in this whole overview. I stole this list from a talk by a professor out of Dartmouth recently, which kind of I liked it, but he kind of pointed out that when we now think of security and privacy in context of IoT systems, there are a whole bunch of other issues, sort of issues that one has to deal with. So he kind of came up with this list. When we create these devices and systems and deploy them out in the field, it's almost always that they need to be configured, they need to be reconfigured, and all of that needs to be done securely. Oftentimes the breaks, they get broken into because the update process or the reconfiguration process itself is insecure. Things may have multiple owners, and that creates a complexity also, that there are often devices, like even your family level devices, kind of there are multiple individuals with whom there is an ownership relationship, and that can complicate it. Occupants can move across environments, so so I may have a sensor and I can carry it with me to different places, or I may visit different places where I encounter different IoT devices. So again, there's a constantly changing relationship mapping between individual to IoTs devices and devices to spaces. So that's another point. Things will move across environment. Things may transfer to a new owner. You may sell stuff, and what if you didn't disassociate it? So you sell your some security system from your home, and it's still associated with your home account, and also it has to be cleansed appropriately. It's kind of the equivalent of selling your laptop without wiping the disk. Environments may transfer to a new owner. If you sell a home and which has all these things, smart stuff built in and all, you have to be very careful to make sure that there is no association left with you, because kind of like essentially the equivalent of wiping the disk clean, kind of wiping all the digital traces from a home. And it's increasingly becoming quite difficult. I mean, I guess I mean, I always encounter the challenge, like I call it rebooting my home, that I mean, after a major power outage, or if I'm away from a vacation and all, kind of bringing together multitude of devices back up is often a challenge. They're not sort of coordinated and all as well. Things may fail, and if they fail, they should do it in a graceful manner, in a manner which doesn't cause issues. Like, for example, if my smart lock were to fail, it should not cause a situation where I'm totally locked out, stuff like that. So you have to think through those cases also. Oftentimes, privacy terms and these kind of things change. So the relationship with vendor is quite important. Now that your lock or your some other device in your home is dependent upon software upgrades and bug patches and stuff like that. I mean, it used to be you would buy a lock and then it's a 20-year thing, and you never would have to go back to the manufacturer. But now sort of there is this dependency through the software. Vendors disappear. That's also there, and sort of kind of a whole bunch of lists that come up. So that together does lead to kind of a whole bunch of questions that people are exploring. Systems which are multi-owner, multi-user, where there is a transient relationship, and this particularly comes up in things like privacy and all. Also intermittent connectivity, security of the platform itself, because these are out there unattended, potentially subject to attacks which your traditional computers are not. Mobility of users across systems. How do you authenticate humans? How do you authenticate data sources? And secure deprovisioning and destruction. That mechanical lock I could just take and throw it away, but perhaps you don't want to do it with a lock which is controlled by some software in some company's service, and a whole bunch of stuff like that. And the final point, and which is also important, is that ultimately security and privacy, these kind of things are not in the absolute. They're always relative to the risks they present and the impact those risks potentially have. You're not going to spend lots of money if the impact is going to be relatively tiny, and so it's also important not to over dramatize some of the risk. One has to kind of just take them case at a time. But I think the consciousness about these issues in the privacy aspects of our data and all kind of is something which is always only on the increase, because as episodes as things keep happening. Just one sort of Yeah, just to cite one episode just from kind of recent week or two. So we all, or at least many of us here, have social security numbers. It's assigned to us when you are born here or when you immigrate to this country, and that sort of number stays with you, and on one hand you are supposed to keep it protected, on the other hand for so many transactions we need it, and so it has kind of entered into this kind of thing. We are required to keep it safe, and yet we are required to hand it out. Other countries are in early stages of it. So some of you are from India. So India a few years ago started on this very ambitious plan. So they call it the Aadhaar number, ANN or something like that. Okay, yeah, but it's a biometrically attached number. So in the sense, it's a number, and the government has also collected fingerprint, retinal scans, and stuff like that, and it's all part of some massive database, and it's being used for all sorts of things. Now, if you visit India, or if in India, you can't really get even more basic services unless you are authenticated through your Aadhaar number. So even things like getting a SIM card and stuff like that are all based on that. So recently, what happened was that there was a breach. That a newspaper reporter found that for a small number of dollars, she could get access to the database and all the information other than the biometrics. So she couldn't, but everything else she was able to kind of get. And there was a uproar and stuff like that. So mechanism that they have now come out with, and which is kind of interesting and something that people in the security community have talked about, is this distinction between core ID and a persona. So kind of the idea being that my core identity is who I am, right? Particular person, that identity. But for specific transactions, the identity I need could be some sort of a virtual identity, and that may be revocable. So the essence in the problem is, once I hand it out, there's no way of revoking it, because that's the only identity. It's my core identity, and it's also my transaction ID. So what they're headed towards in India is now that you can go to this website and you can generate a virtual identity number and use that for a specific transaction, presumably revoke it, tie it to a particular vendor, whatnot, and come back. So this issue of identity has received kind of a fair bit of attention, and the India context is interesting because, I mean, this is a system with 1.3 billion people, so they are kind of deploying it at that amazing scale. Another technology which people have talked about using there in this context is using blockchain. So you hear about blockchain in context of bitcoins, but blockchain is the underlying technology behind Bitcoin. Anyone knows what blockchain does, loosely speaking?
It's a ledger, and the blocks are set of transactions which are verified by miners.
Okay, so what functionality therefore it provides?
A decentralized ledger that everyone has access to and can verify.
And so what does a ledger, what is the core functionality of a ledger?
Record transactions.
It records all transactions. It's an agreement between parties that these are the transactions that have happened in the order they have happened. It's like a consensus over something. So in computing, achieving consensus that we all agree upon something, right? A variable has a particular value. We all agree upon the location of a particular thing, or what time it is, or anything like that, right? That's at the heart of so many things we encounter in computing. Did this read happen before write, or write happen before read? Is the sum of these things 10 or not? These are all examples of consensus. Now, consensus is very easy if everyone is close by within the same computer, but it's extremely hard when it is distributed. And there's some very it's a tremendously challenging problem, because we have to trade off something there. Okay, so what blockchain does is it basically provides a mechanism to have consensus among a set of distributed parties in a manner which achieves something desirable. Now, in this particular case, with Bitcoin, it gets applied to the fact that what transaction, who paid whom, and therefore at any given point in time, we can go back and look at the set of transactions in that ledger to work out how rich you are and how rich is someone else, or whatever, who owes what, those kind of things. So the identity, I think you would see is kind of an interesting stuff. Potentially another topic for those of you who are considering doing a survey type project. I think mechanisms, particularly around blockchains and all for management of identity, I think that could be a good topic to explore or even potentially implement. I think software packages are out there. Perhaps consider something along those lines. Okay, so that was a high-level view of what the state of affairs is when it comes to security and privacy. Now we are going to dive into specific topics. So the first set topic that I want to cover is looking at how attacks are done. Okay, and I'm going to start with looking at the way attacks are being done in cyber physical systems. Then I'm going to look at follow-on lecture on the more conventional software type attacks, but again with an emphasis on some of the side channel stuff which has come up. But we're going to start with just kind of the CPS type thing. So some of this you kind of saw in this previous slide set, but at a higher level. We're going to dive into this, and I'm going to specifically examine two types of systems: medical implants and vehicles. And then the third one, industrial control system, I would do it through a paper, which is going to be for next Thursday. Since no one volunteered, so I'm going to just select someone. You do? Okay, terrific. Thanks. Okay, so I'll post the paper and, okay. So medical implants is the first one I'm going to spend some time on. So when we look at medical implants, there's some trends which are evident and some characteristics which collectively add up to some interesting kind of risks or security risks at the present. So firstly, these implants are becoming very common as our ability to miniaturize electronics and create tiny sensors and tiny actuators and all has improved. A lot of diseases and all, we have begun to design things. I mean, groups like Professor Bill Kaiser's out here and some of the others who kind of specialize in making these kind of devices. Okay, sometimes wearable, sometimes implanted inside the body. If you pacemakers obviously have been around, cochlear implants for hearing, infusion pumps for insulin or other type of drugs, neuronal stimulators, these are emerging now, deep brain stimulation where for things like epilepsy and certain other diseases where they kind of essentially shock the neuron, so to say. Defibrillators, these are all examples. And moreover, these things are increasingly becoming more and more smart in the sense that they are connected, they employ algorithms, software, sort of just generally. So pacemaker used to be kind of a simple analog circuit, but then over time they became digital, they became connected, all sort of things. So huge amounts of sort of computation and signal processing and machine learning and all getting either embedded in there or sort of in the cloud component, and kind of the two talk to each other. So that's one thing. Second, on the characteristic side, there are obviously, just given their very nature, they're pretty constrained devices. And so computing is limited, storage is limited, bandwidth is limited. So a lot of things that you can take for granted on big processor do become challenging. So for example, a very traditional, common way that we do encrypted communication, for example, something that I sort of shown in one of the slides earlier, is that you use public key crypto to establish keys, and then you use symmetric crypto to actually do the thing, because public key crypto is computationally expensive, whereas symmetric key can be done much more rapidly. But precisely because public key crypto is computationally expensive, doing it on a puny little microcontroller inside a pacemaker thing can be pretty challenging. Also, it's difficult to replace things, right? I mean, if you can't simply swap out the hardware because these are surgically implanted, and that carries its own risk, cost, complication of infection and stuff like that. So that part in itself has led to that these devices are often designed so that they can be remotely updated. That is, the software on your pacemaker can be updated in the doctor's office. That's how these things are now designed. Collectively, these things then do lead to some kind of vulnerabilities, and I'm going to show some of the attacks that people have done and sort of what were the issues. Broadly speaking, leaking personal information, which could then be misused in some manner. So for example, in many cases, much like a lot of other computing systems, these things are unnecessarily uh, designed to carry unnecessary data. So you might see even like patient ID and stuff like that held inside the device, which kind of is unnecessary, but it is. And so messages can be intercepted, could lead to blackmail. I mean, even trivial stuff like, I may have some disease. I don't want the world to know about it, but if I have an implant corresponding to that and it's just emitting these signals, and then the fact that I have that disease in itself is problematic revelation. And then physical harm to a patient. We could potentially manipulate these devices to physically harm the patient, not just from a reputational perspective. So like overdose, dangerous stimulation, and stuff like that. So one example which has appeared in literature quite a bit, including literature and TV shows and stuff like that, as you'll see shortly, implantable cardioverter defibrillators. So defibrillators are kind of like the next evolution of pacemakers that happened. So pacemakers basically corrected sort of aberration in rhythm, so kind of make sure the heart is pacing right when it went into some sort of a mode where the rhythm was not okay. What defibrillators do is they can deliver big electrical shocks to the heart, so that's to restart it, reset it. So you see defibrillators often mounted on walls in various places, and also in aircrafts and all airports and all, because with those electrical pads and all to kind of revive the person. This is kind of the implantable counterpart of it, where it can give a big electrical shock, but that is on, like, from what I read, it kind of feels like someone kind of just like a big someone big hit you. Okay, I mean, this is not like a minor shock, it's like a huge jolt. Okay, so these things are designed for with wireless communication, and there are broadly two types of wireless links that they have. One is a long range one-way link, where the defibrillator sends out a message in case there are problems with the health of the defibrillator itself, okay, or presumably some other urgent issue, so as to inform the doctor of malfunction. And also these are long range links, but they are one way, so an adversary cannot mess with the device, but an adversary can certainly prevent the signal from going out and whatever consequences therefore result from it. But they also have a short-range link, which is designed for reprogramming or reprogramming the parameters or updating the firmware or stuff like that. And typically, it is done by either bringing the programmer a few inches away from the patient, so kind of some sort of programming van, or alternatively, some versions, they allow reprogramming to be done from a few meters away, but then there has to be some sort of an identifying thing near the patient. Okay, so still kind of proximity is required. That's kind of the idea. So so these things have then been shown to have kind of issues. So interference using radio signals. So these kind of attacks have basically rely on the fact that by placing EM interference near the defibrillator, you could cause it to malfunction. So while these things are designed with shielding and stuff like that, but you could still cause EMI to interfere with the operation. And the defibrillator might mistake it as result in an incorrect estimation of the heart state, and therefore fire or not fire or things like that. And these kind of attacks also work with kind of other medical implants. This is why, for example, they say if you have a pacemaker, don't go through the metal detector, for example, right? Because it interferes with the operation. So you could have a malicious sort of thing going on. Apparently, these sort of in stores when you exit, when that kind of thing which checks whether someone is stealing some item from the shop, those things can also trigger it. So there are examples which have occurred. So that's one possibility, and I guess in some adversarial situations can certainly be exploited. The other one is to exploit the wireless link, and this had gotten a lot of attention some years ago. This was some work out of Washington and University of Massachusetts and a bunch of places. But basically, the thing that it relied on was that, as is common with a lot of these kind of devices, the wireless communication is either not encrypted, or if it's encrypted, it's very poorly done. I guess it's very common that in the wireless world, the standards for communication, the protocols and all are just hacked up, typically by hardware engineers or electrical engineers, and there's hardly any kind of, let's say, high quality security researcher engaged in it. This is why, for example, the first generation of Wi-Fi crypto, which was called WEP, those of you recall the early generation of 802.11 used to use that, that has become kind of a laughing stock in the crypto world, that everything that could be designed wrong, they designed it wrong, even though it was done by a committee of a lot of supposedly well accomplished people. What a lot of researchers have done, and this paper being one example, they would use some software defined radio. Sort of a few years ago, there was pretty much one game in town, something called USRP, Universal Software Radio Peripheral, still around. It's sold by National Instruments now, but it's basically a USB device with transmitter receiver based on FPGAs and covering a whole bunch of different part of the spectrum. So you can basically snoop at the spectrum, you can generate radio waves, you can do all kind of fun stuff with that. So they showed that they could extract device and patient information. They showed that you could mount replay attacks, where you capture a signal and then replay it later on. You can tamper with therapy settings, you can override the data in the device, and of course you can mount denial of service attacks, where so these kind of things could all be done. And the lest you think, okay, so this is just some people sort of academics kind of writing it and all. I mean, the threat was deemed serious enough. So firstly, one of the primary authors, faculty authors on this paper, then ended up going to FCC, kind of leading the whole effort in the space. But the other thing is, it actually caused Dick Cheney to disable the wireless functionality of his defibrillator. So Dick Cheney, those of you who don't know, was former vice president under George Bush, and so the wireless feature was disabled, which is kind of a risk, because what it now means is that if something happened to his device, it may not be known immediately, other than the symptoms that would manifest. And the other thing is, it would require an operation to replace, because you can't reconfigure it from outside. But anyway, that's what he did, because kind of the worry that they had was that some terrorists from, let's say, a neighboring hotel room or whatever, next table in the restaurant or whatever, can cause issues. There was episode of Homeland, which is a TV show on Showtime. It's kind of its whole theme is based around America's fight in Afghanistan and kind of combating terrorism and all. So that there was kind of an episode based around this kind of whole theme of a terrorist killing the vice president by controlling his device. So this falls into the category of, it's difficult. There are a lot of things that need to go right for one to be able to do it, but certainly possible. In particular, while the reprogramming function, which is a real dangerous one, because that's how you will reprogram the device, while it is designed for short range links and stuff like that, there are a couple of worries. Number one, lots of studies have shown that these supposedly short range links actually can often travel sort of far enough distance. Okay. The other thing is, the short range link and all can still be susceptible to relay kind of attacks and all. Remember, the entity sending the message to the device can be far away, because it can be high powered, and then I can have some sort of a device which picks up the signal coming out of this low power device and then relaying it, okay, to the farther away location. So what you really need is some sort of a relay near kind of the patient. There are, of course, things which can be done to address these also. To begin with, stronger crypto and these kind of things. Wireless always remains an issue because that can always be jammed for sure. But on the other hand, these devices remain implanted for years, so it's not something that every time a vulnerability is discovered, you're going to go and kind of immediately replace these devices. That's not done either. So kind of a valid threat. Another example, insulin pumps. So insulin pumps, those who have people who have diabetes and whose insulin control is not good. So based upon the blood glucose measurement, these pumps essentially inject insulin. Okay, and they come in various varieties. In some cases, sort of the patient activates it based upon a remote. In other cases, the sensor sends a message to this something which is implanted kind of under the fat tissue, and that's the one which is controlling this thing. So these kind of things are around, and now the modern generation, I mean, you can literally go to Apple Store and buy something which works with your iPhone and kind of use that. So they're pretty commonplace. They're kind of like essentially autonomous version of the typical blood glucose measurement kit, home kits that one can buy in CVS. So there is a interface to the pump through which the infusion is activated, deactivated, the infusion rates are controlled and all, and lots of vulnerabilities in these systems have been discovered. Again, sort of research groups mounting the same kind of security analysis attacks just like they did it for the defibrillator. So this was a group out of Princeton who kind of did this work, or at least one of the early ones to show these kind of vulnerabilities, where again using a software defined radio. So in this case you see USRP, again these guys are using that as well, this guy. So that's the software defined radio. So they use that to snoop and kind of decipher what is going on. So it turns out in this particular case, the pump that was being used, it basically, the way it worked was that there was a pin, and which is kind of like a supposed shared secret between the remote and the pump and between the sensor and the pump. Except for a couple of things. The pin is actually just written on a label on the device, so if you peek you can know the pin, but more importantly it was actually just being sent over the wireless link out in the open, plain text. Okay, so not really a crypto, but like, I mean, just some sort of a very crude pairing mechanism. So these guys exploited that, and a paper which kind of highlighted a whole bunch of attacks that could be mounted. So firstly, there's a privacy attack, right? I mean, these implantables and wearables are partly designed to reduce the social stigma in addition to kind of the comfort. So I don't want to advertise the fact that I have a particular disease, but of course my wireless signature is advertising it. So existence of therapy, but not just that, what my blood glucose level might be, because that was going out in the open, the medical condition that I am in, and so on forth, and also the device pin. So it's being sent out, so which is kind of a stupid design. Since the device, if you know the device pin, then the spoofing is also easier. So now you can send a message which activates, deactivates the pump or controls its rate at different times. So so in particular, these guys found that the system used a pretty broken mechanism to combat against replay attacks. So what they would do is the following: that to defend against replay attack, they would see that if some sort of a count ID, there was a packet had some sort of a count field, ID field, and they would just check whether that value was the same as a previous packet, and if so, they will discard it. If not, they will accept it. So all these guys they were to do with the replay attack was they captured 2 packets and just kept sending it. So the ID was never the same, and therefore it kept accepting it. So case of essentially a poorly designed system. And jam the wireless channel, which is kind of always there. And if you know the pin, which the first line of attack helps you do, then there are other things you could do, including reporting false readings and stuff like that. So essentially, kind of a whole set of attacks that could be mounted. And then a final weakness in a lot of these systems comes from an indirect attack, because many of these modern devices rely on an app running on your phone. And that model now is that, so you have this medical system in place, but a critical part of the medical system is your own device. This is called the bring your own device model. So it lowers the cost, but all the vulnerabilities that come with your device kind of are there. So there are well-known malware, particularly on the Android side of the world, but even the iOS side is not exactly immune, where all sort of covert channels and all which can be done, which can be done. So this is kind of the final attack vector, that some sort of malicious app is now able to look at the stored values. Sometimes it could be just a case of bad permission. So to give you an example, on those of you who have iPhones, Apple has this thing called Health Kit, which is essentially an on-device database where health-oriented apps can deposit and can read readings, and there is a permission system. But it's often very easy that that application may mislead you into giving permission which is too excessive. It may show you a long screen of permissions, and you may be lazy and just say, okay, go ahead, accept, you're in a rush. So permission, oftentimes you kind of discover that, that's not what I intended. Yeah, so those kind of things can happen. But then also, even without all of that, there are viruses and other kind of things which have emerged, which kind of can, particularly if you visit shady websites, download, which may inject this various kind of malware onto your device, then you are potentially can be at risk. So this kind of malware can obviously steal data, but can also control the device. It can send an incorrect configuration parameter to the device or activation command to the device. All those risks are there. It gets into one of those categories where research can only point out what is possible. Research will never be able to show necessarily that such an attack has actually been mounted, because even when it is, you may not know that that was the cause. So this paper from Princeton was 2000. Let's see, the original one was 2011, and there was some work in 2010. But as recently as 2016, pumps in the market still have these kind of vulnerabilities. So this is a new pump from, I forget the name of the company, but it was one of the big pharma players, and essentially the same kind of mistakes. I mean, the one which keep getting highlighted again and again, but I think sort of the community which designs these things, I think the security consciousness is often secondary. So if you read from kind of this article, the flaws stem primarily from a lack of encryption in the communication between devices' two ports, the insulin pump itself, and the remote that monitors blood sugar level. I mean, exactly the stuff which paper 5-6 years ago highlighted. So, so these things are unfortunately still with us in plenty of devices, and I guess furthermore, the replacement cycle is at many years scale. So to summarize on the medical implant side, then for a variety of valid reasons, these devices need to communicate with the outside world. We need to reconfigure them, reprogram them, when bugs are found, fix them, and so on and so forth. But this does open to the usual things which come with a wireless link: jamming, snooping, relaying, all those kind of things. Since these devices need to be energy efficient, particularly implants which are sitting next to the heart or in the brain and all, I mean, there are all sort of other issues like things sitting in the brain. Even their heat dissipation has to be very low, severely energy constrained. So collectively, they kind of end up placing a lot of challenges. So encryption is often done very weakly, very poorly. Not that makes it right, because at some stage if things are vulnerable, then that's a bigger risk than having to just replace the device on a shorter time scale. So so unencrypted communication or poorly encrypted communication, security by obscurity. That's a very common theme, and it's a absolute no-no. So one thing about security, and it's something I've seen even like my own students kind of fall into the trap of, which is you have you cannot assume that the adversary doesn't know your algorithm. Okay, in fact, the only acceptable model for designing a secure system is that you have to assume adversary knows your system. It knows the algorithm you are using. That cannot be a secret. That cannot remain a secret in kind of current age. Okay, so but that should be your security model. The only thing that you can assume that the adversary doesn't know would be a key, which is a small finite key, which and for which you have a good mechanism to securely distribute to trusted parties. Um, Devices asking for too much, knowing too much, embedding too much stuff in the device. There is no reason for device to know the name of a patient and stuff like that. That can all be in some sort of a secondary database. And I guess all of this really highlights that for a lot of these kind of devices, medical implants, and we'll see shortly vehicles, security has been not kind of a first order concern. So there's a lot of vulnerable stuff out there. So there have been some excellent work in this direction, and sort of at least the relevant funding agencies, the Health and Human Services Department here, National Institutes of Health, they have funded in recent years large-scale projects, centers in this domain. So a lot of stuff, at least we know how to fix it, and there is also a better understanding of a lot of things, but it will take time for these things to kind of begin to roll out into the actual devices and all, because also the design and certification cycle of these things are pretty long also. But I mean, the vulnerabilities are just not limited to the things I highlighted. There are plenty of medical devices. So many of them are so easily can be fooled so easily, and particularly when now they are also entering into things like your insurance company giving you a discount if you share your health readings or if you exercise regularly. Well, guess what? You have all the motivation to have your Fitbit lie now, right? I mean, so all these kind of financial incentives are also entering, and so the ability to cheat and the desire to cheat, they are all kind of there. Okay, so that was medical implants. Let's do the following. Let's take our break a little bit early so that I'm at a logical switch point. We are going to talk about vehicles. So let's do our 5-minute break and restart at 5.
So I had a question about the blockchain identification of IoT devices thing we kind of talked about. So the way I envision that working would be basically in your public database, you have like public keys for every device on the chain at their point of inception, whenever they're added to the network. And then for the blockchain identity verification to work, then all the communications between the devices would have to be encrypted using that public key, either as a handshake at the beginning for like symmetric encryption or just using that for messages.
So what's the problem that you will seek to solve? Like, I mean, what is the information?
So that no one can basically jump onto the network with another device and
Okay.
impersonate
So you
the device.
so you are guarding against Sybil attacks, right? I mean, unauthorized
verification of identity, basically, whenever you have any communication.
Okay,
But I mean, is that feasible in like an IoT home network device? Like, does that use too much power with all the encryption that's going to need to be used?
Not necessarily. Firstly, not all devices are necessarily wireless or
Yeah.
they may be wireless, but they may be wireless for communication, but still plugged in. I mean that's
Yeah.
a very common paradigm. So even for these things, because like an attack where I kind of visit your home and then surreptitiously plug in into one of the obscured power outlet and then begin to muck with your IoT system at home.
Yeah.
Those are all valid attacks. So
Okay.
yeah. So I think this could be good,
That'd be a
interesting.
good project.
Yeah,
Okay.
but scope it out. Like I mean, maybe look very specifically on just a particular specific attack that you are after. I mean, so yeah. But I think it's a valid.
Okay.
Okay.
So, as for the Amazon example that you just mentioned, that you have some data to use the Amazon like cloud service to do the computation, and if, for example, you put it X, and then you do some like encryption, and then Amazon returns you like something like FX. So, can you use the same key to like the encryption, the same thing, so you can get something you can understand, or
No, so the way I work is that I encrypt using a key. I send it to Amazon. It does the computation and encrypted data. It sends the result back to me. Amazon doesn't get to ever see the X. I get the result. I use the same key that I had used to decrypt it, and I get the answer back.
so the reason like you mentioned like the protection using the processor is because Amazon may also like use try to like
No. It's just efficiency, right? I mean, in the sense
you
that
just don't want them to see it, right?
huh?
You just don't want them to see like very easy.
Yeah, you don't want them to see, you don't want to get to know X, right? The problem with this encryption approach is that in computation on encrypted data is slower. Even the partially homomorphic one is still 100 to 1000 times slower. If I want to do full speed computation, then the secure hardware enclave approach does it. Okay,
Oh,
so
wow, I
right, I mean,
understand.
it lets you run full speed,
Okay.
but with the cost that you have to trust in them.
But why is slower then?
Why processing on encrypted data is slower?
Yeah.
Um,
Because
uh,
basically you like enlarge the
no, it's not simply about the enlarging. It is the way now you do computation. I mean, that gets into the particular form of the encryption. But so yes, the data grows. So some of the thing is that it takes more to transmit the data and kind of handle the data. But it's also the way that whole computation process is organized. Okay. And the fully homomorphic, I don't understand it, so I won't even attempt to explain it. Partially homomorphic, I will have a student present a lecture. Part of a lecture to kind of
so
describe how it does.
that technique like leverage the benefit from the processor. Does that require Amazon like server?
No, it
server
doesn't. It doesn't leverage anything on the processor. Okay, you can do it on any processor. You can do it. You can even sort of partially homomorphic stuff and all is useful even at the level of um, like you can have a home server or stuff like that. Okay, so it doesn't require anything from the hardware, although you could accelerate it by making use of GPUs or FPGAs. So that is certainly possible. I've seen work where they make use of FPGAs to speed up the computation, the encrypted computation. Okay, so that certainly is done. Yeah.
So who will like set up the request, or I'm just saying like, so
Oh,
the user will request that this amount data has to be done under this,
right. So like
register.
right now, I send a file to or whatever some data to a web service, and it computes something on it and sends back the result. Now imagine that there is a web service which accepts encrypted data. And it doesn't ask you for the key. It just asks you for the encrypted data. It will run this modified version of the computation, which is designed for encrypted data, and send back the result to you. The result is also encrypted, and the service never decrypted anything.
Yeah.
Okay, the result I get back is encrypted. I decrypt it using the same key that I had used to send it out, and that key I had not given to anyone. Remember, it's just I generated a key.
Yeah, I
used it,
understand this
yeah.
part. My question is like, when you want to do the computation in the protected processor area, so do you have need to like send specific request that asks the Amazon service to do that?
Okay, so which version are you talking about? Are you talking about the secure hardware one or are you?
Secure hardware.
Oh, okay. In the secure hardware one, yes. So you will have to ask Amazon for an instance of a machine which has a secure hardware enclave. And I don't know about Amazon, but Microsoft Azure has it. So you can buy a secure hardware equipped instance of a machine from them, whatever, by the hour or whatever. So Microsoft sells it as a secure computation service. Yeah, and then there is a key management interface with Intel.
So you have to control over the machine you buy.
You have. I mean, all these service. I mean, you say that I'm interested in secure computation. These are obviously going to be costlier. I mean, they charge more for it, and then you also need to talk to a key management service, which is managed by Intel. So that's how it works. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Sure. Okay, so let's restart. So actually, there are some questions over the break, so I just wanted to kind of clarify some of the points I kind of brushed over, perhaps a little bit too quickly. So, two ways of doing outsourced computation over encrypted data. One is using techniques which are based around homomorphic encryption or partially homomorphic encryption. And so now imagine that nowadays we often have web services. We send some data to them, they send back the result. Now imagine a version of those services which are willing to operate over encrypted data, and they internally make use of computation libraries that are designed for homomorphic encryption, encryption kind of systems. So in that case, the model would be: I have data, I'll encrypt it, I'll keep the key with myself, not tell the key to anyone, send the encrypted data. This service, which has been designed differently, kind of operates on it and sends back the result. It never gets to see the data because all it receives is encrypted data, no key. It does the computation, it gets some other result which will look again some gibberish because it's still encrypted. I get back that encrypted result and I work on that, and then I decrypt it using the key I have. Okay, so in this case, there is never ever at any point on the receiving side anything unencrypted. Okay, so just take the penalty in this case is slowness, and both because the data got bloated up and also because computation over encrypted data is slower. Okay, so like the same operation, like an addition which would be one clock cycle, would now require multiple operations in the encrypted domain because we are just doing things in a different domain. So I'll have my student Amr give a if he comes back from Egypt, give a lecture on his work. Otherwise, I'll attempt to present something in that space. The other one, which is also practical, is that you are now going to work with a cloud service provider who has one of these processors with secure hardware enclave and is giving access to it. So Microsoft actually has been the first out of the first to provide this. So they have a secure computation type service. So just like when you go to Amazon or any other cloud service provider, you get a virtual machine instance, right? So here now you get a secure instance. The idea behind secure instance is that you are not even trusting the operating system, okay? But there is an enclave, and your application is going to enter the enclave, and then only then inside the enclave decrypt any data. So like, for example, let's say I want to process a set of sensor readings. So I'm going to encrypt the sensor readings, and then my application, once it has entered the enclave, then is going to talk back to a component of my application running on my machine, my local machine, and then I'm going to send the encrypted data, and it will be decrypted inside the enclave. So nothing can ever see it. It's like a network tunnel going into the enclave, and it's all encrypted, and inside the enclave it gets decrypted, and then it is processed in plain text there. Okay, so I have extended my trust boundary, kind of a bubble, into the other processor. And the reason we trust that bubble is because Intel is vouching for it. So my application, local application, will have some sort of a communication with some key management service with Intel to kind of verify that. So that's conceptually kind of how it works. And this is again commercially available at this stage. I don't know about Amazon, but I know Microsoft advertises it, so it's out there. This could actually be another interesting project area to think about, which is create a library for processing, I don't know, some sort of sensory information or doing some machine learning algorithms or something by leveraging this kind of a library, creating something like this. So I can, from my phone, I can comfortably send data for processing in the cloud, and kind of the result comes back. And so essentially, instead of saying my sensitive data never leaves the phone, to now we say my sensitive data never leaves the phone unencrypted. Okay, but I can still leverage all the processing out there. Okay, so now moving on to another category of CPS systems, and that's vehicles. And I'm interpreting vehicles here somewhat broadly. I mean, at this stage, we have not just stuff which is on the ground, kind of both on-road and off-road, but we have flying stuff, obviously traditional airplanes, but also UAVs. And then we have stuff on water, boats and kind of submersibles and stuff like that, for a variety of applications. And many of these which didn't exist only a few years ago. I mean, UAVs being used for filming and stuff like that, they have kind of become pretty commonplace nowadays. Again, some trends are been affecting this industry. So a lot of vehicles are now increasingly connected, vehicle to cloud services, vehicle to infrastructure, that nearby infrastructure, roadside in case of cars or things like that, and vehicle to vehicle. They are increasingly becoming autonomous to various degrees, and then also, I guess, they are designed using manufacturing chains which are now quite global in their footprint, in the sense that things are sourced in one country, incorporated into a subsystem in another country, and the subsystem gets incorporated into the eventual vehicle in another country. And these things, obviously, this thing also presents the opportunity for that chain to be compromised, kind of an insider attack, something kind of sitting in there, and then one fine day kind of causing issues. I've been sort of I know there is in recent couple of weeks, there were all these news items like how AT&T went back on offering the Huawei Mate 10 phone, I think, or because they got pressured by US Congress that the company is too close to Chinese government and all. And I often keep thinking about, we have all these drones, most of the drones being made by DJI, which is a Chinese company, and no concerns about that. So one fine day, or something causing all of them, I think that's far more dangerous than perhaps the phones. But in any case, I think the risks and the reputation of the company behind this, these are all kind of valid issues, and I think they come up. Characteristics wise, if you look at these vehicles, I mean, they are making use of I mean, the penetration of computing into these devices is pretty amazing. I mean, they're just a modern high-end car probably has a few hundred processors at this stage, and galore of sensors and networks and all. And as a result, these things just generally are hard to secure. A lot of functions are inherently quite difficult to sort of make risk-free out here. So let's examine some of the ways these things have been attacked, these things have been hacked, because some of these attacks have ramifications in other type of systems also. So the very first one, obviously, is the wireless link. We saw in medical implants that was a weak link. In case of vehicles, there is obviously a lot richer set of usage of wireless. So as I was making these slides, I kind of started thinking, what are all the wireless links that my car has? So it talks to things inside the car in variety of ways, using Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, and some proprietary wireless links. It talks to my phone, it talks to tire pressure sensor, and there are a bunch of other these kind of things, I mean, that kind of exist in modern cars. Tire pressure sensor in many cars, tire pressure sensing in some cars is done by measuring the difference in wheel speed, wheel rotation, but in a lot of other cars, the tire pressure cap has the pressure sensor built into it, and then it transmits wirelessly, and that's how kind of it is done. Devices near the vehicle, usually through some proprietary link, so to the keys, to the garage door, these kind of things. Roadside infrastructure with traffic control signals in particular. I don't know if you know, but like buses and ambulances and all, they have the ability to control the traffic light so that they can kind of race through. So emergency vehicles have that. It is done using a radio standard called DSRC, which is a little bit like 802.11. It's kind of a modification of that. Then of course we have GPS, location and time information. It's one way, but it's a wireless link. It's a sensor, also obviously. Remote services, talking to them. So using LTE and also often Wi-Fi for a variety of purposes, fleet management, condition-based maintenance. This is very much a norm now, that instead of saying bring your car every 3 months or 6 months and whatnot, now in many cases cars are designed so that they inform you when to take it, so that depending upon your driving habits, maybe you'll never need to take it, or take it once every few years. So I think that's pretty commonplace. Vehicle control, being able to remotely lock unlock the car, honk, turn on the AC, these kind of things are getting commonplace again in sort of cars, or even some cars you can kind of use your key fob like a remote control, or you can kind of command the car to come out of the garage, or those kind of things happening. Entertainment and informational services, emergency kind of situations under accidents and all. And then of course software and data updates, I mean, that increasingly are happening in many vehicles as well. And then finally, wireless links which talk to nearby car. This is a concept which is called VANET, Vehicle Area Network. Again, usually done using DSRC or maybe using Wi-Fi, but also there are things like LTE Direct, which is a version of LTE designed to talk to among nearby devices for purposes like safety, coordination, communication. So like cars can share information with each other, so that if a car is going to suddenly stop, it tells cars behind it that I'm going to be stopping, and so that they are kind of prepared. It's certainly useful in autonomous driving setting, but also useful as a human assist also. So cars have it, needless to say, kind of all this rich set of wireless thing. UAVs also have the same story. I mean, if you think about modern UAVs, there are tons of different radios that they kind of end up using. Even kind of the low-end stuff, the toy UAVs come with multiple different radios nowadays. And so you have ground stations through which usually some sort of a smartphone or kind of a dedicated device with apps and all. So it actually kind of a an ecosystem which is not all too different from we are seeing across a variety of different kind of vehicles. So one way these things get attacked is obviously attacking the wireless. So theoretically straightforward, as we kind of saw with the medical devices also, you can disrupt the wireless link by putting noise at the right frequency, or also injecting excessive packet traffic so that packets look reasonable, but they force the receiver to process them and then burden it, and can then result to both denial of service because the network is occupied, as well as denial of service because I bogged down the receiver, okay, because it has to process and all. GPS signals, because they are quite weak, because they're coming from the satellites, are particularly vulnerable to these kind of jamming. But basically, in principle, any signal can be overcome if the adversary is powerful enough in terms of its transmit power. Snooping. So commonly this is basically done by reverse engineering. So you acquire the signal, you break the cipher, you mount man in the middle kind of attacks. And then finally tampering, where you either jam and then relay or delay, and then replay the signal, or you jam and spoof. So the idea is I prevent you from hearing the original thing, and then I'm going to sort of inject something else. And finally, I think it's actually there are lots and lots of nice SDR devices, software-defined radio devices, available now for one to conduct these things, and they range from $200-300 to $5,000-6,000 depending upon their sophistication, but they're kind of all out there. So one place where so firstly, vehicles have always been used as enablers of wireless attack, and that's not interesting to me, but I'm sure many of you may have heard the term war driving. Anyone knows what war driving is? War driving? No one? Okay, so war driving refers to the notion that you take one of the readily available software packages which are out there with a Wi-Fi radio, and then you just drive around your city and look for vulnerable Wi-Fi access points. People who are either running unprotected or are using some old key systems and all, and then you put this thing into a database, and there are an entire database about this. So basically, it's a pastime of sort of the underworld, sort of say out there, which basically are looking for open networks there. So so obviously car was an enabler there. Okay, but here we are interested in hacking into the car. So the first type of system within cars which became subject of attacks were the immobilization systems. So early on, cars used to have basically mechanical keys. You go inside the car, you insert the key into a key fob, you turn the key, the car turns on. But then the problem that would exist with that is that you could hotwire the car. Anyone knows what hot wiring means? Why? Everyone is very saintly in my class, I guess. Huh? Well, you lost your key. So what you do is you kind of get the mechanical part out, short the two wires, and start it, right? That's how you see it in the movies, right? I mean, that's hot wiring. Okay. So, yeah. Okay. So anyway, so to bypass that, pretty soon most countries began to mandate, most Western countries, that keys be authenticated. So then the idea became that when you insert the key, in the plastic part of the key is a RFID tag, and then embedded in that whole key gizmo in the steering wheel is some sort of an interrogation, and then kind of it checks whether the key is authentic or not. So that's and if not, it immobilizes a car. So that's the immobilization system. So these systems basically therefore rely on this RFID transponder. Those of you who don't know RFIDs are basically, so there is a passive side, which is basically kind of some very simple circuit, can operate on extremely low power current and all. And what happens is that the transponder interrogates the key, which has the RFID tag in it, by sending out a strong radio signal. That radio signal serves two purposes. It kind of conceptually powers the circuit, and then that circuit operates and sends back a response. Usually, in this particular case, this is a key or a response to a particular challenge. So it's getting a message and it's doing some simple operation and sending it out. It's extremely power constrained because it's operating on the energy it is harvesting from the radio waves. So the kind of stuff it can do has to be very simple. But so this guy challenges, this guy responds, and this guy says, okay, this is a valid key, so let it start. That's the concept behind the immobilization systems. So they, hang on a sec. Okay, so majority of these things have been broken. They exist in many cars now, at least kind of, let's say the lower end car for sure still have the immobilization systems. We'll see shortly that higher end cars have something more advanced. But they've all been broken due to weak or poorly implemented cryptography. So remember, they are RFID powered, so they are extremely limited in terms of the energy requirement. So weak keys, it, I mean, in the early 2000s or whatever, in let's say in the 2000s or aughts, 40 or 48-bit keys, nowadays 48 or 96-bit keys. Point is, they are still significantly lower than 128-bit keys and all, which you kind of end up, or 256-bit keys that you kind of use in regular transactions, can be broken often in minutes in right tools. And furthermore, the implementations are often flawed. So like, for example, there's a chip, one of the popular chips out there, it uses a 96-bit key, but many of the bits in the key are known to be 0. So effectively fewer keys, or maybe they'll have some pattern in it, or just the process of the generating the key. So a variety of kind of holes that exist in these systems, which again goes back to security by obscurity is a bad idea, because these manufacturers dream up with some obscure thing thinking no one will ever figure it out, but always happens. Okay, the world is too smart for things to remain obscure for long. So so that happens. So these immobilization systems are all broken, so not terribly interesting. The challenge, the more interesting challenge for researchers in recent years were the so-called keyless entry systems. So these keyless entry systems started out as kind of ones where your key is now a remote device like this, and it has these buttons for locking and unlocking kind of things. And you go near the car, you hit the open button, car door opens, and so on. That's how they work. And the first generation of these things worked by that you press the button, and then ID and a button, which button it is, and key ID, and the button will go out. And then, of course, as you can imagine, this is kind of like the open pin scheme with the insulin pump. Someone snooping at this can now see what the UID is, and then later on kind of just repeat that. So the replay attack becomes, or spoofing attack becomes quite easy, and you can do it from far away if you so wish. So this kind of fixed code scheme is easily broken. And in fact, these fixed code schemes were also present in other systems that used these kind of remotes, like, for example, garage door openers. They behave the same way, and so you could, or kind of opening the doors of entry gates of apartment complexes and all. So they're all broken because of this. So then could we fix it? So how would you fix this? Yeah, any thoughts? Okay, but if I encrypt the message as I'm sending it, my encryption looks the same every time. So I can still capture it and replay it, right? I mean, if I were to simply encrypt UID and button, right, then every time the message will look the same. So I'm just going to, I don't have to break your crypto, I'll just record it and replay it whenever I need to open it. So that won't work. So a point, subtle behind the scene point then is that if I'm sending the same message, I need to make sure it looks different every time it is encrypted, right? Because if it looks the same, then adversary's job is pretty simple. It just has to record it and replay it. Okay, so how can you make the message look different every time it is being encrypted? Say it again?
Run down the code every time.
Well, so I do need to send some sort of a shared key, right? Because otherwise it won't be able to authenticate. So, but I still need to make this thing look different.
So instead of sending just an encryption, your key is used for the seed for a random number generator. They both have the same seed, but it's your key that only those two people have. And then from then on, they'll be synced. They'll understand how to decrypt it.
Okay, so you're saying I use this thing for a random number generator, but now one thing you're relying on is that your random number generator should be very good.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, okay. But there's an easier way of kind of doing it. It's kind of a little bit along the lines of you're saying it's not random, but what if I were to simply put a counter out here? So I said three things: UID, button, and a counter. And every time I want to enhance the counter. Now remember, property of encryption is that in the encrypted domain, things look random, right? So, so if I have UID button, comma, counter value 0, and another one which has the same UID, same button, but a counter value 1, in the encrypted domain, there is no correlation between the two, right? Encryption by definition randomizes things, right? So that's kind of the idea, that what we do is every time we press the button, we are going to send, we are going to encrypt the counter along with the button that we are sending. So like I'm sending counter plus 1, counter plus 2, and so on and so forth. Okay. Now, of course, if you're like me, you probably press your key needlessly at home also. It's part of fidgeting. So they have to allow for those things also. So the receiver side is going to attempt, say, last time I saw this counter, this time around I'm expecting counter plus 1, but maybe the person was fidgeting, so kind of allow for a few more extras. Okay, so it searches over a band validity window, as it kind of calls it. Okay, so that's the basic concept. This is called rolling keys, rolling code. This is what actually is also used in garage door openers and stuff like that also. Yeah.
If the adversary is figuring out that he's sending a counter, why wouldn't they just increment it and send?
Because it will never get to know what the counter was, right? Where it is, right? So he has to mount essentially, so presumably validity window is a small fraction. But this does need to be implemented carefully. Okay, so let me cite you an example. I mentioned WEP, which was used in Wi-Fi, was broken very easily. So they were using something similar, but the mistake they made was that every time the system was reset, it started the counter from 0. Okay, mistake number 1, because every time the system is reset, you get to know it is registering and all, and therefore that was people were snooping into it. And the second thing is the validity window was pretty tiny. It was like 80,000 or something. So in a couple of hours, you can easily monitor enough messages to now have a look at the data with multiple values of the same counter. So you do need to make sure that this is long enough and that when you are initializing carefully. So I think in case of web, the adversary model that they have in mind was that you are working in Starbucks and I just come next to you and start listening to the packets from your laptop. Okay, and if you are engaged in a couple of hours of working there, I can break your system. So web was broken very, very easily. Okay, in every crypto course they kind of bring it up as an example of how not to do it. You were raising your hand.
Yeah. So the user is just playing around with the key and like but he's far away from the card and the counter value set keeps on incrementing. Then he might actually, when he wants to try to use, he might actually not get the card unlocked because like he's away from the validity.
It's possible. So there are various ways around it. Firstly, you could also have a bidirectional system so that actually it doesn't increment the counter until it receives an act. So that's one way. The other is, if it happens, then you have to repair the key. So I think those are kind of second order details, which obviously for usability they would have worked out. Yeah. Any other question? Yeah.
Why isn't it just bidirectional? Like it doesn't increment unless you get a response from
To keep it simple. So these things are unidirectional, but you will very shortly see there's a version which is bidirectional. Okay. Yeah. These things were just designed like TV remotes. Okay, or your garage door remotes. They are not bidirectional. Yeah, cost reasons or whatever.
Does it take distance into consideration?
This thing doesn't. So the idea is you have to press the button if you are too far, just like if you are pointing your remote from the TV in a different direction, the same thing. If you're too far, it won't work. So again, if you're too far and you are pressing, then again that could be another reason counter can increment. So if it doesn't open, the idea is presumably you go closer and then press the button again. So that validity window has to account for fidgeting, not being in range, those kind of things. So to break this thing, I mean, you have two things. One thing you can go after is attack the key management, right? So remember, underlying this thing, there is still this thing that the card and the key have a shared secret, namely that they have to they have to know, and perhaps that could be broken. So that's the secret key. And often, so one thing in crypto is that key distribution is pretty challenging, particularly when you are doing at this massive scale, hundreds of millions of product and all, right? Because it's not simply I want to distribute the key, but I also want to be able to keep them secret. I want them to be able to revoke them. There are a lot of desirable properties, but they're not necessarily always met. Oftentimes, what car manufacturers do is they have a small number of global master keys. So just a small number of keys, and which they use across different models, and also your car may get one of maybe a small number of keys that exist. Moreover, these keys are often embedded in the firmware in the ECU. Moreover, the firmware in the ECU can often be extracted. Okay, so if I'm out to attack a particular manufacturer, I can certainly go and buy some of these cars, or maybe go into the salvage yard, get the ECUs, which are basically microcontroller boards, extract the firmware, and I have access to the key. So they are essentially relying on security by obscurity, right? Which is saying this is buried, who would go to the pain of extracting, and therefore would happen, but it does. Option 2, stack the crypto. As I mentioned earlier, crypto is often implemented poorly, weakly, whatnot. Side channel attacks, cryptanalysis, these kind of things people bring to bear, FPGAs and stuff like that to break it. So these things have happened, and happened at scale. So some years ago, there's a group out of UK who found some vulnerabilities in Volkswagens, and they were going to publish at major security conference, and then Volkswagen went to the court and got them to stop. So they had to not present the paper. So that was 2010-11 timeframe. Same people in the year 2016 found a different type of vulnerability again in Volkswagen. So 100 million of them had this vulnerability, and kind of this paper, so this is 2016, used a security system where they kind of publish. So I guess the challenge in part is that, again, manufacturers keep taking this thing lightly, I guess. And if you read the paper, it's actually a very readable paper. Describes how they went around, sort of breaking this thing, and kind of a lot of the history behind it, the way it works and all. So there's a rich body of work over 20 years or so now. This is kind of the more recent example of what happens. Just recently, as in like late fall, there were apparently lots of cases of Teslas being stolen in Norway, where apparently someone would come with a laptop near the car and pretty soon drive away with that. So even a car as recent as this one has issues. Okay, you can blame Leon. He worked at Tesla. Okay, so you worked on the key system? No. Regular. Well, it's convenience. You don't want. I'm going to lose too much weight having to take up that, right? Okay, so these keys still had a button. So in that spirit of making us more lazy, then emerged another innovation called passive remote keyless entry and start system. Kind of the idea is now you are not going to take the key out at all. Okay, it remains in your pocket. You don't have to press the button. You don't have to put the key into the car at all. Just go in. In fact, literally, Teslas don't have a start button. You enter the car, it turns on. You put your hands on the steering and you press the accelerator, and off you go. Okay, so the way these systems and other cars have kind of variants of the same system. Okay, so the way these systems work, they are detecting proximity. No buttons need to be pressed. So when in proximity of the vehicle, the car key generates a cryptographic response to some sort of a challenge that the car issued. Okay. And by the way, these very same cars now also allow your app to turn on the car also. Okay, so I can turn on my car, set from anywhere on the planet, for example. Okay, so but these remote keyless systems basically try to detect, is the key inside the car or within a short range around the car. That's basically what they kind of look at. And then depending upon the specifics of the system, there might be kind of different ways of organizing that handshake, but very loosely it basically boils down to, there's a challenge, there's a response, the car validates, and it says, okay, the key is good, it's close by, and it's a valid key, then it's going to turn on the car, unlock the doors, whatever, all those functions are done. And guess what? This opens up a vulnerability. And again, you could imagine this being used for medical implants and all also. And that is a vulnerability to a relay attack of the following nature, which is the attackers work in pairs. One attacker is sitting near the car. The other attacker is sitting near the owner. Okay, and the key. And then essentially, the way things work is that these things are designed usually so that the key to car communication tends to be long distance, but the car to key communication tends to be short distance. Okay, that's how they kind of limit range. Okay, and that's how many of these car pieces are. But you can imagine another configuration, maybe relay on both the links, but that's the concept that you essentially enhance the range of what is otherwise a short range. That's what's going on. So it was shown by a group called EPH Zurich, and then subsequently other researchers from Germany, China. The most recent one was a Chinese group, which kind of showed that we can do this thing with like $20 worth of equipment. So and kind of shown multiple manufacturing styles are susceptible to this. So the challenge out here is that the problem of knowing that someone is in this case the key. So the key is the entity which is trying to prove that it is close to the car, that it is no more than, let's say, 1 meter away from the car. That's a pretty hard problem. We are going to actually spend a good part of a lecture kind of going into some of the techniques and all there. But this is verifiable ranging. Okay, we want to prove that you are no more than a certain distance away. Okay, which is in this case. And you can imagine other uses of this, right? Like for example, I see now that when last week I went to the student union to withdraw money from Wells Fargo ATM, and now they say I can withdraw money without inserting my card and all, and through my phone. Okay, and that leads to the notion: how do they know that I'm actually there next to the ATM taking money out? Okay, so so presumably they have some sort of checks and all to see whether I'm the one next to the ATM. So this notion that a service provider will provide a service only if the customer can prove that they are close to the service provider is quite a useful notion. Emerges again and again, including in this case, and it's vulnerable to this relay attack if not done carefully. Can you also think of the reverse? That is, I want to prove that I am actually farther away from a certain point, and only then it is valid. So think about it. That's the reverse problem, right? And then the other related problem is not simply the range, but the particular location. You're going to provide me a service only if I am at a particular geographical location. So there are all these variants and has received a fair bit of attention, and they are tricky problems, particularly because on one hand, you have to worry about noise and all, which introduces uncertainty, and yet you are worrying about, so the adversary can hide behind that uncertainty, sort of say, right? So we're going to look at some of these things, but just to give you a peek ahead, one of the ways the original paper also sort of described it as to have a very tight latency. One thing we do know is speed of light, right? So if all of this thing, right? I mean, this guy has to capture relay, and then this guy has to capture relay. All of that can add to the delay, and therefore, if I could measure that, then I could say, look, you must be far away. But then my own system has to be such that it has a very tight delay bound, right? I mean, that in the normal course of operation, challenge response, I should allow for very little budget for it. If I'm allowing the key to be no more than 1 meter away, then my challenge response should happen within 1 meter is what, 3 nanoseconds or whatever, 0.3 nanoseconds, something like that. Okay, split in nanoseconds. That's unrealistic, right? So tighter bounds. Now what we have to see is that what are the adversaries' capabilities? Now, unfortunately, the state of the art there is also advancing very rapidly. People are coming up with fancy way of doing this kind of relaying without having to go into the complex digital domain. I can have fast FPGAs, stuff like that. So the game out here is a race between how much delay this guy will introduce and what distance I'm trying to protect. Because if the adversary can be super fast, then the delay checks will not work. But loosely, that's kind of the idea that I could use some constraint like this because of speed of light, something about geometry, stuff like that, which could help prevent this. There are other ideas which are floating around also. Another idea which appeared recently is, it won't work out here, but the point was that that Brooke made was that a lot of times these attacks would happen when I go home, I put the key on my kitchen table, and now it's sitting still. So the point is, if the key is still and a challenge response is happening, then there's something wrong, because if I'm near the car, it's not going to be that I'm going to be still. But obviously, it won't work in this setting where I walked away from the car to pay the parking fee or stuff like that. But maybe some variant of that. Could I detect that the key left me? Maybe the key can be paired with my watch. Maybe my watch should be the, I don't know, the stuff that you could imagine doing, kind of further add some further layer of validations. Again, potentially an interesting area to explore for project. Okay. Another attack vector on these cars is the fact that these cars have lots of computers and lots of networks. So essentially, a whole bunch of functionalities which used to be mechanical are now sort of controlled through buttons or touch screens or whatnot, or through apps on the phone, and also within the car, kind of essentially equivalent of fly-by-wire technology. So things which had mechanical coupling are often now sort of electrically controlled. So as a result, cars have lots of computers and at least a small number of distinct networks, some for high-speed information like media information, and a lot of them for kind of low-speed kind of information. The computers in the car are typically called ECUs, engine control units. It's kind of a misleading term because what they're controlling may have nothing to do with the engine, but they're basically embedded computers. They receive measurement from sensors, they process them, they generate signals for various things, whatever, window rolling up and down, all those things. High-end cars kind of have hundreds of these. Some of them may be very sort of resource-rich computers, GPUs and all. A lot of them might be simple microcontrollers. The most important ECU is the engine control module, as it's called, and this one is the one which controls the timing and all of the engine. Of course, electric vehicles won't have it, but kind of the traditional ICE vehicles would. Now, since these are all computers, like any computers, they have bugs. They need to be fixed. This is what happens when there is a recall. They go and sort of update the firmware of some ECU. So therefore, ECUs are designed to be updated. So for bug fixing and all, but oftentimes the process of doing it relies, guess what? This is a story we have seen again and again, on security by obscurity. Okay, so say, this would be some instrument which only the mechanic would have, or they will have some half-hearted attempt at crypto, if at all. So, for example, there's a very vibrant tuning community for installing modified software on the ECM. Actually, Southern California, LA region is actually a hotbed of this kind of stuff. So all these people who do drag racing on Sepulveda Boulevard and all, I mean, there's a huge community. You can buy these modified ECUs to install. You can update the firmware. They play around with the engine cylinder timings and all, so that you can have faster acceleration, stuff like that. Okay, it's kind of all the stuff is out there. It's a very vibrant community, and you can easily buy this stuff, and there's nothing illegal about it. So the problem now becomes that, okay, so how could we go around kind of doing it? So firstly, a little bit about the network itself. So the most popular network in the car is something called CAN bus. It stands for Control Area Network. And the way it kind of works is that it's a twisted pair, twisted whatever, like your telephone wire, okay, twisted pair cable. And then there is a arbitration type system for nodes to access the bus. So essentially nodes compete for the bus by doing a bitwise arbitration. It's a little bit like transmit and all these lines are open circuit type lines, and then there is a wired ANDing happening out here. But kind of the basic idea is every node transmits and then also sees what is actually going out on the bus. And as long as it keeps seeing that what it is transmitting matches what it is receiving, things are okay. Because what's happening is that all these layers are simultaneously transmitting. They have a shared clock. So in this case, like there's a start bit in the first one. This node transmitted a 1, this transmitted a 1, this transmitted a 1. Everything okay. In the second one, same story. This guy transmitted a 0. This guy transmitted a 0. And so the bus line would have a 0. Third one, but eventually at some point there is going to be a mismatch. And when the mismatch happens, what's happening is one node is transmitting a 0, the other is transmitting a 1. And so I think it has a pull. So it has a weak pull up on the bus. One of them is pulling down, so the bus state would be 0. So the guy who's transmitting a 1 and he's seeing a 0 on the bus, he'll say, I lost that round, and then he pulls out, and then the other remaining nodes continue. So you have this multiple rounds of arbitration happening. Eventually, there is the last person remaining, that's the node which gets the bus. So it's a priority-based arbitration access which is happening on each message. So every time you have to transmit a message, you kind of go through this bitwise arbitration based upon the ID of the node or priority of the node, and then you kind of transmit. So this slide kind of shows kind of a round by round thing. I will not walk you through it, but kind of a basic idea is reasonably simple. So what's happening in this bus is all nodes share a single communication medium. Every node hears what is being transmitted on the bus. All nodes are trusted to be legitimate, and the communication is unencrypted and unauthenticated. That's how the network in the car is. And as a consequence, all sort of attacks that you can imagine can now happen. You can spoof messages. So if I can have a rogue ECU plugged into the car network, I can fake readings, I can request unsafe actions, I can replay, I can fuzz, which basically refers to the attack where I bombard the network with random data until something interesting happens. Denial of service attacks, all these kind of things are done. And finally, you have ready access to the network. There is this OBD2 port, which I mentioned earlier as well, somewhere usually under the steering wheel well, and there are ready available dongles which can then connect to the CAN, essentially act as a bridge between the CAN bus and your some USB, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, something like that. And there are plenty of open, nice software packages available, ranging from disabling resetting the check engine light or those kind of things, fixing sensors and stuff like that, to, if you know what you're doing, modifying the ECU firmware and all those kind of things can all be done. And you just go and kind of OB2 hacking. There is plenty of information out there. Potential for large-scale attacks also exists. So people have talked about these. Malware compromising the laptop the mechanics. That's what I mean, these mechanics peek inside. I mean, basically hook up their laptop to the OBD2 port, and that's how a lot of the functions nowadays happen. If that gets compromised, all sort of the infection can spread widely. You can also imagine you give the car to the valet, and sort of the OBD2 port is unprotected through that. So there are plenty of attack vectors sort of that exist. Most people don't even know there is an OBD2 port, let alone look down to see if someone didn't surreptitiously plug in a bridge out there. So it's an unprotected network with a ready-to-access port, and therefore kind of at least an easy vector of attack through which things can be done. So again, several papers have highlighted that how easy it is to modify the firmware. These are standard microcontrollers. In fact, some of the microcontrollers you may have used, they actually already have CAN bus things and all, so they're nothing terribly out of the ordinary about them. You can decompile the firmware, you can examine them, you can do all sort of fun stuff. So I'm going to stop out there. We are going to look at sensor type attacks next time when we meet. But next time we also have 2 of the presentations. So just a reminder that everyone has to submit their reviews. And okay, so see you then.